today's Newsmaker segment on Bottom Line, we're fortunate to have with us two members of the State House of Representatives. Representative Stephen Ross, a Republican from Alamance County, and Representative Ken Goodman, a Democrat from Richmond County. And they've co-sponsored a piece of legislation, House Bill 904, to create a new fund to help stimulate business in rural North Carolina. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us today on Bottom Line. Tell us a little bit about what House Bill 904 does.
Well, what House Bill 904 does is it creates a fund for investments into the rural areas, into job creation. What we found in the study commission that we did in last session, or in the interim, on access to capital in the rural areas, was that rural areas of North Carolina struggle when it comes to creation of capital or lending to small business, to the point to where it really is a detriment to being able to even get a business up and running in, say, a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 county. So what this fund does is creates an opportunity and directs that the funding would work or would go into the Tier 1, Tier 2 areas. And if there's funds that go into a Tier 3 area, it has to go into a distressed portion of that area.
Representative Goodman, what was the inspiration behind this legislation?
Well, if you live in rural North Carolina like I do, you know how hard it is to get access to capital. And North Carolina has some great programs for business like the JDIG program, but 80–90% of that money goes to metro areas like Wake and Mecklenburg County. This is a true public-private partnership, I think the first of its kind in the country, which will provide capital and management expertise for expanding businesses in our part of the state. So I think it'll be a great tool for rural development in North Carolina.
So, and this question probably goes to both of you, if you can explain this a little. I'm having trouble understanding why a private enterprise would join and put money into a public fund when most of the jobs that were created, as you correctly pointed out, in the last 10 years have been in the big counties. So while you're saying public-private, I'm trying to understand the private part of it. Can you explain that a little more?
Well, these private equity firms have to put up their own money. 10% of the money has to be from the particular investor involved. $50 million would come from the state of North Carolina, $50 million from private equity. They have to invest all of this money, 70% of it has to go in Tier 1 counties within 3 years. And they get a credit back for every job created. In a Tier 1 county, I think it's around $15,000 a job. In Tier 3 county, it's $7,500.
So private equity, by definition, always looks for an exit strategy. That's what private equity funds are supposed to do. So if I'm a private equity and I'm putting out of this $50 million, what is my exit strategy, or am I just...
Well, they can take an ownership stake in the company, they can make it a loan, so they will earn interest, they can earn a return on their investment. Plus they have the benefit, if they create enough jobs, they get this $50 million without having to pay it back. So that's a pretty big incentive.
And what's the oversight of this money? Who is responsible for making sure these private equity firms are honoring their obligations under this provision?
This will operate through the Department of Commerce. I think, going back to the question on the private equity firms, if you look at one of the reasons why it's hard to get lending or get capital into the rural areas is because your traditional sources of lending there are so many factors that go into the risk of whether we're going to make this loan or not. And typically the risk factors are so great in a rural area for the typical or traditional lending sources that they won't do it. So what a private equity fund does is it gives an opportunity here for them to get in, put in their own capital, and the risk is taken by the private equity firm, and in turn the capital that they will accrue as a result of meeting the job creation is a return to the private equity fund.
And they get not the money, but in form of some sort of a credit.
That's
right. Just to that point, don't you think it probably would have been a little easier to go? We have a lot of rich individuals that like to park their money in this state. Is there a sort of a parallel thing that you might want to consider reaching out to them? Because it'll make them feel good that they're putting into rural North Carolina rather than a private equity firm or a institution that does different kind of loans where they would always look for an exit out?
Well, there are a lot of wealthy people that don't want to put their money into private equity, and private equity firms are looking for a place to park money where they can get a return. So it's a specialty type thing. This incentivizes them to put their money into, say, Robeson County, Richmond County, instead of Wake and Mecklenburg. And that's the deal, that 70% of that money has to be invested in Tier 1 counties. So.
And what is it that makes sure that the private equity funds that are utilizing this are following the guidelines and doing the things appropriately? How do we make sure that the money's being used appropriately?
Well, there are guidelines written into the legislation that are directed through the Department of Commerce, and there are certain criteria that they have to meet, and they will also have to report as to exactly what has taken place with any grant funding that's been made. And they have to report back as far as the job creation also. So there's a process for being able to follow and make sure that that what we intend for this to do is actually what's done.
And along the way, if they're not meeting the requirements of the program, they can be called back. The money can have to come back to the state. They have to invest all of the money within 3 years. And the program ends in 6 years. At the end of 6 years, it's over. So they either pay the money back for not creating the jobs, or we continue to move forward. And one other thing I might point out, that the bill only requires a 1-to-1 stake. These private equity firms could put in a good bit more than a 1-to-1 ratio. They could, instead of 50 million, they could put 100 million. Once they come down, find these businesses, they may want to invest more of their money. So it could be even better than what we're looking at.
So you're sort of looking at a clawback statute,
Oh,
right? Just like the
definitely-
JDIG.
There's definitely a clawback. And since you mentioned JDIG, the cost of this program to the taxpayer, you're saying, why would the state give private equity firms $50 million? The cost per job here averages about $12,000 a job, which is right about where JDIG is. So the cost of the state's not going to be any greater than, actually the cost of the state will be zero if they create the jobs, because the people that get the jobs will pay enough in taxes to cover the cost of the program.
What are the types of initiatives that you think these funds will go toward? What kind of businesses, what kind of operations will benefit from having this capital now available should this become law?
I'll give you a personal example. We used to have a textile business in Ellerbe, North Carolina, in Richmond County. We worked about 180 people. We had an opportunity to expand the business, expand the plant, add about 100 employees. It was going to cost $7 to $8 million. We could probably go to the bank and get 3 or 4, but we could not. The banks will not loan a business like that $8 million. So private equity could have come in, taken an ownership stake, or taken made a loan to the company at a little higher interest rate. We could have expanded the plant, added more employees, and everybody would have been a winner.
Yeah, and I think it's important in that to note that it's not only just new business. This is also existing business that's already in, say, a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 county.
Right, and there is no program that I know of in the state right now that provides incentives for existing businesses.
I did look. There are a couple of programs. It's a little deviation from what you are suggesting. I think just the challenge I think you will face is the company's willingness to give ownership stake. Private equity, as we all know, it's tough money. They don't like to lose money, and they want to know how they can make that money back. While job creation is wonderful, all us as North Carolinians tout job creation because it benefits the state. Private equity have a different ballgame in there.
It's tough money, but you've got to remember, in this particular situation, these are tough lending opportunities. These are not your normal lending opportunities that one of your banks or a banking institution would lend to. So in that respect, toughness meets toughness, and I think that is one reason why this particular funding mechanism is probably one of the, it hasn't been tried before. It's relatively new. I'm convinced this will work. We studied in the interim access to capital in rural areas and really could not come up with another solution and found no other sources that would put this kind of capital in the areas that we're trying to get it into here.
And to your point, the state match sort of lowers the risk to some degree.
doubt.
And if you can't find, if private equity says we can't find the investments we like, well, no harm, no foul. They give the state their money back and go their own way. So I think that's a pretty easy call.
As a final thought, what would you say to any critics? Well, there are people that would say economic incentives and set-asides of public money maybe not the best approach in terms of providing capital for business. What would you say to those critics that say government doesn't have a role in these types of things? What does this bill do that someone who maybe doesn't support these types of things provide for in terms of protections, or it's different in other ways that we use economic incentive monies?
Well, I think that for me, I always look at return on investment and what exactly are you trying to accomplish. And we struggle here in the General Assembly all the time about funding sources in the rural areas. And we all know that most of the economic development takes place in the Triangle area or the Triad or the Charlotte area. And we never have been able to put our finger on exactly what needs to be done in these more rural areas that where businesses struggle, can't get money, have lack of access to capital. And so I think that if we look at the cost savings ultimately to the state in creating jobs in areas where they're needed, then I think it's a win for both the rural areas of North Carolina and the state as a whole.
Representative Ross, Representative Goodman, thank you very much for joining us today on Bottom Line.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.